Pollination is the mechanism of transfer of pollen grain to the stigma of the pistil. Kinds of pollination. Depending on the source of pollen, pollination can be divided into three types. Autogamy. In this type, pollination is achieved within the same flower. Transfer of pollen grain from the anther of the stigma of the same flower. In a normal flower, which opens and exposes anthers and stigma, complete autogamy is rather rare. Autogamy in such flowers require synchrony in pollen release and stigma receptivity, and also the anthers and stigma should lie close to each other so that the self-pollination can occur. Some plants such as viola, oxalis, camelina produce two types of flowers, chasmogamous and clistogamous. Chasmogamous flowers which are similar to flowers of other species with exposed anthers and stigma. Clistogamous flowers which do not open at all. In such flowers, the anther and stigma lie close to each other. When anthers dehisce in the flower bud, the pollen grains come in contact with the stigma to effect pollination. Thus, clistogamous flowers are invariably autogamous, as there is no chance of cross-pollen landing on the stigma. Clistogamous flowers produce assured seed set even in the absence of pollinators. The second type is geitonogamy, transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Although geitonogamy is functionally cross-pollination involving a pollinating agent, genetically it is similar to autogamy since the pollen grains come from the same plant. The next type is xenogamy. Transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of different plant. This is only type of pollination which during pollination brings genetically different types of pollen grains to the stigma. The next topic is agents of pollination. What are agents of pollination? The agents which is responsible for pollinating the plants use two abiotic, that is wind and water, one biotic agent, that is animals, to achieve pollination. Majority of plants use biotic agents for pollination. Only a small proportion of plants use abiotic agents. Pollen grains come in contact with the stigma is a chance factor in both wind and water pollination. To compensate for this uncertainties and associated loss of pollen grains, the flowers produce enormous amount of pollen when compared to the number of ovules available for pollination. Pollination by wind is more common amongst abiotic pollinations. Wind pollination also requires that the pollen grains are light and non-sticky so that they can be transported in wind currents. They often possess well-exposed stamens and large, often feathery stigma to easily trap airborne pollen grains. Wind-pollinated flowers often have a single ovule in each ovary and numerous flowers packed into an inflorescence. A familiar example is the corn-cob tassels, which wave in the wind to trap the pollen grains. Wind pollination is quite common in grasses. The next is water pollination. Pollination by water is quite rare in flowering plants and is limited to about 30 genera, mostly monocotyledons. As against this, the mode of transport for the male gamete among the lower plant groups such as algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes are the pollinating agent is water. It is believed, particularly for some bryophytes and pteridophytes, that their distribution is limited because of the need for water for the transport of male gametes and fertilization. Some examples of water-pollinated plants are Vallisneria and Hydrilla, which grow in fresh water, and several marine sea grasses such as Zostera. Not all aquatic plants use water for pollination. In a majority of aquatic plants such as water hyacinth and water lily, the flowers emerge above the level of water and are pollinated by insects or wind, as in most of the land plants. In Vallisneria, The female flower reaches the surface of water by the long stalk, and the male flowers or pollen grains are released onto the surface of water. They are carried passively by water currents. Some of them eventually reach the female flowers and the stigma. In another group of water pollinated plants, such as seagrasses, female flowers remain submerged in water and the pollen grains are released inside the water. The pollen grains in many such species are long, ribbon like, and they are carried passively inside the water. Some of them reach the stigma and achieve pollination. In most of the water pollinated species, pollen grains are protected from wetting by a mucilaginous covering. Both wind and water pollinated flowers are not very colorful and do not produce nectar. Majority of flowering plants use a range of animals as pollinating agents. Bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, wasps, ants, moth, birds, and bat are the common pollinating agents. Among the animals, insects, particularly bees, are the dominant biotic pollinating agents. Even larger animals such as some primates, arboreal rodents, or even reptiles have also been reported as pollinators in some species. Often, flowers of animal pollinated plants are specifically adapted for a particular species of animal. Majority of insect pollinated flowers are large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar. When the flowers are small, the number of flowers are clustered into an inflorescence to make them conspicuous. Animals are attracted to flowers by color or fragrance. The flowers pollinated by flies and beetles secrete foul odors to attract these animals. To sustain animal visit, the flowers have to provide rewards to the animals. The nectar and pollen grains are the useful floral rewards. For harvesting the rewards from the flower, the animal visitor comes in contact with the anthers and the stigma. The body of the animal gets coating of pollen grains, which are generally sticky in animal pollinated flowers. When the animal carrying pollen on its body comes in contact with the stigma, it brings about pollination. In some species, floral rewards are in providing safe places to lay eggs. An example is that of the tallest flower, Amorphophallus. The flower itself is about 6 feet in height. A similar relationship exists between a species of moth and the plant Eka, where both species, moth and the plant, cannot complete their life cycle without each other. The moth deposits its egg in the locule of the ovary, and the flower in turn gets pollinated by the moth. The larvae of the moth come out of the egg as the seeds start developing. With this, I conclude and will continue with the next topic, outbreeding devices, in the next video.